episode of the GSU Briefing. I'm Bhuvanya, I'm your host for the day, and today we are joined by Ishan Jasuja, the founder and director of the GSU. As the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting is underway, today we are going to discuss the geoeconomics of Southeast Asia and the risks and opportunities lying in the investment landscape of the region. So let's get started. Thank you so much, Ishan, for being here with us. I think the best way to start this discussion is the GSU's Geoeconomic Risk Barometer. In the latest edition of the Barometer released on the 1st of July, what risks and opportunities stood out to you?
Hello, Anya. Thank you very much for having me on this very timely podcast. I think everyone is looking at Southeast Asia, although we have got several disruptions going on across the world right now, be it in West Asia or Eastern Europe. Southeast Asia does emerge as one of the most prominent regions from at least a commercial lens because there's a lot going on over there. In the Q2 barometer, which you just mentioned, we found quite a few interesting developments that investors and global stakeholders should keep their eyes on. Primarily, we saw that the region, although is going through a lot of turmoil, especially commercial risk from American tariffs and supply chain disruptions in the energy sector, it remains quite a resilient sort of investment landscape. We, just from a straightforward growth standpoint, expected the region to grow by anywhere between 4 to 4.7%. And we have seen official figures, especially from the meeting that you have referenced in the introduction, standing at around 4.6%. So we have definitely remained in the ballpark, which is a positive sign. However, as I mentioned earlier, the growing cost of energy and American tariffs, I expect to dive into the details of those as we progress through this episode, because Marco Rubio and Vietnam especially have had quite deep discussions on the subject, and the rising power demand because of AI and all the other energy intensive investments in the region is putting upward pressure on energy prices, especially when we are seeing disruption of inflows from West Asia. At the same time, we are seeing a lot of geopolitical competition between China and the United States, particularly in the South China Sea, as China tries to position itself as both a military power in the region, at the same time, a reliable trading partner, economic partner for ASEAN countries, particularly in face of American tariffs and trade uncertainty.
Yes, Ishan, you have mentioned some really central factors that affect the Southeast Asian economies. So I think we should start with the supply chain realignment and the energy shock that has been affected since the Strait of Hormuz was closed, because around 80% of the energy and LNG that comes through Strait of Hormuz is being imported into Asia, and it has really put these economies into an energy shock. And that's why we are seeing great emphasis on critical minerals and renewable energy in every meetings and every bilateral talks that are happening here. So why don't we dive into the sectors that are being given importance by the ASEAN member states?
Yeah, let's start with the first order effects of the West Asian crisis on Southeast Asia. That was primarily in the form of rising oil prices. However, we very quickly, because that was priced in by the market and people were expecting it, we quickly moved on to talking about the second order effects, which hit Southeast Asia much, much harder, especially countries like Indonesia with rising currency stress, rising FX stress. This really put them on the back foot when it comes to global trade. We also saw the trade deficit of Vietnam, especially close to double, right? Because things did not work in their favor from a cost of input standpoint, from a trade standpoint, and supply chain standpoint. So these external trade balance reversals, particularly in Vietnam's case, show that the investor confidence and business confidence in the region might be teetering because of everything that's happening in West Asia. So we have moved on from just a pure oil price shock lens. We have now started talking about how does this feed into inflation? How does it feed into interest rate recalculations and reworking of interest rate expectations, and therefore currency risk, FX risk, not to mention the trade deficits that have been rising, especially in Vietnam.
Yes, and that actually brings me very naturally to my next question about the US China rivalry that you mentioned. Do you see the Southeast Asian nations bolstering a strategic autonomy amidst the US China rivalry?
Yeah, when we see different countries being impacted by different conflict in different ways, they always try to figure out the most optimal solution for their current economic stress. Now, with ASEAN, it is quite significant because they're trying a lot to integrate their economies more seamlessly, especially from a customs standpoint, a trade standpoint, a supply chain standpoint. And we see reflections of that in the discussions that have been happening in the ongoing ministerial conference. This also extends beyond Southeast Asian countries. We are also looking at and following closely discussions between ASEAN member states and India, the US, Chile, all these major trade centers that lie beyond the region. The interesting observation in all of this, however, is the challenges that Southeast Asia continues to face from a geopolitical standpoint, because it is a strategically important region. And everything that we've seen in West Asia with trade choke point vulnerabilities also extend significantly in Southeast Asia, be it the Singapore Strait or the Strait of Malacca. China has been very, very serious about solving and eliminating these vulnerabilities because its economy depends on efficiently importing energy from the rest of the world to itself and then exporting its goods all over the world. At the same time, we see the United States getting significantly involved. If we look at Marco Rubio's statements, we see significant investment in the critical minerals space because the US also wants to stabilize its supply chains of CRMs, and Southeast Asia plays a very critical role in figuring out how this is going to be operationalized, right? The South China Sea remains one of the most important arenas and theaters for geopolitical competition, especially in the maritime sphere. We see it becoming increasingly important to global supply chains. In the Barometer, for example, we noted that it is responsible for around $5.3 trillion of goods transit throughout the year, and repeated incidents with China and other Southeast Asian countries from a security standpoint are raising insurance costs and encouraging countries and companies to have larger inventory buffers. But at the same time, it is quite interesting to look at it from the lens of Philippines, which is hosting this year's ministerial conference. Because if you are Philippines and you're leading the negotiations, at least in today's meetings, you have to sort of walk a diplomatic tightrope because you do not want to antagonize China too much on the military front, because Philippines has been on the receiving end of several Chinese transgressions in South China Sea. At the same time, the economic interests of the Philippines and other Southeast Asian countries really depend on having reliable relations and steady relations with Beijing. So we're very closely following discussions along these lines, and Philippines sort of dual role on diplomatic conversations with China.
Yes, and I think it is very important when we talk about regions. Until now, I was just talking about Southeast Asia. I think it is very important to sort of dive into different member states of ASEAN as well.
Mhm.
Because if we look at ASEAN together, the economy is very different. And when we dive into different sectors, there are disparities amongst the economies themselves, all the member states. So, why don't we talk about the risk adjusted opportunity score, the framework that we have developed here at GSU, and how the member states can be analyzed and their economic risks and investment opportunities can be analyzed using the RAO?
Right. This is the most common mistake we have observed at the GSU that businesses and stakeholders often make, which is seeing ASEAN as a single growth market. And it is quite easy to do that given all the turmoil that we're seeing in the global political economy. Heuristically, emotionally get very excited when they see a market that's high growth, and recency bias often encourages them to paint the same picture across all ASEAN member states. However, if we look at it from a data standpoint, the risk adjusted opportunity framework that we have developed in house and is proprietary to our analytical models converts this regional narrative into very diversified market architectures across Southeast Asia. Let's take, for example, Vietnam. This country has offered for years now a strong combination of growth and industrial momentum. But now, as I said, with the recent analysis published in the Barometer, we saw that momentum abruptly stopping. And these small changes are often easy to ignore when we're looking at the big picture, but matter on a macro fundamental level, especially from an investor lens. The most fundamental element I would look at when discussing these countries from the risk adjusted opportunity lens is the takeoff signal. This pillar of the RAO essentially measures the degree to which a country is nearing its takeoff phase. And it is a great way to measure state capacity and market concentration as well.
And I think if I talk really locally about India, I would like to ask you, how do you see India developing its economic as well as political relations with different member states of ASEAN, and where do you see India benefiting the most?
That is quite an interesting question because India and ASEAN relations have been steadily evolving over the past, decades. It started with India's Look East policy when we really wanted to diversify our trade relations with other countries in the global south, and ASEAN provided a very natural avenue for that expansion and diversification. Now we have been on a spree of signing deals across ASEAN. Our Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi was recently in Indonesia, very well received. The deals that we made, especially around the defense sector, have been received with quite a bit of excitement here in India because they provide opportunities for Indian stakeholders, MSMEs, and mid tier manufacturers to really open new frontiers which have previously been closed for them. At the same time, we are seeing Indian firms, especially the larger corporations, looking at many ASEAN economies not only as markets, but also as staging grounds. And we've worked closely with a couple of our clients on this who are very interested in establishing regional headquarters in countries such as Singapore that are quite business friendly and also provide a springboard for entering other ASEAN markets such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and all the other high growth regions in that part of the world. Now, we need to see practically which region offers unique strengths that can be leveraged by parties in the other. ASEAN's advantages are very deeply rooted in its electronics and manufacturing clusters, the dense trade links between ASEAN member countries themselves, strong maritime connectivity, and with customs integrations and economic integration, the ability to use different markets for different functions, like I said, which goes back to my point of countries such as Singapore emerging as financial hubs and other ASEAN markets emerging as destination markets for firms looking to expand into them. India, on the flip side, offers a much larger domestic market. The labor force in this country is quite skilled. The demographics favor manufacturing as China plus one strategies become more common. And even ASEAN headquartered companies want to come to India now to really leverage the massive scale that the Indian market can offer. Now, if we look at this equation, it really opens up opportunities for cross border trade where stakeholders are leveraging the strengths of each region to cover the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of the other.
Yes, and how do you see things unfold in Q3? And what should we look forward to in the Q3 barometer?
Right. Looking at the global political economy right now, it is becoming quite difficult to predict patterns and forecast expectations. But let's give it a shot anyway, because we expect internally ASEAN to remain net growth positive going into Q3 2026 and beyond. But its risk profile, like I mentioned, has been turning more operational on a firm to firm level and a stakeholder to stakeholder level because of different tariff shocks, energy volatility, and all the other things that we have discussed in this podcast so far. However, the main upside historically in ASEAN has been the role of China plus one manufacturing. Now it is transitioning more towards high tech manufacturing because of AI infrastructure and all the interest that the United States is putting into the region for critical minerals, energy, and digital infrastructure. However, like I mentioned earlier, investors should start expecting greater differentiation between ASEAN markets based on different levels of energy security, grid infrastructure, availability, and export compliance. The principal Q3 risk that we see is the second order effects that we discussed in the very introduction, because they will start reinforcing each other now when it comes to interest rates, currency volatility, higher fuel costs resulting in inflation, all those other things. Our best case expectation over here would be start seeing energy costs stabilize as the conflict in West Asia starts to settle down. But due to the various escalation cycles, that has not really been possible as of now, although things started to look positive as the MOU between the United States and Iran was signed. Now that is off the table once again. So let's see what's the new price spike that oil reaches and other related energy commodities. At the same time, we are observing US tariff action to remain quite volatile. We are seeing new waves of tariffs being announced every now and then. At the same time, Marco Rubio has been trying to maintain a stable narrative at the current meeting. And maritime tensions have become a new focal point because everyone has been startled by the disruption that the conflict in West Asia has caused. And shipping insurers, shipping companies, logistics firms will be looking at the South China Sea dispute very, very closely now, especially because of the economic value that has been transiting through that part of the world. So, those are the main pain points that we would be monitoring going forward. Like I said, given the current geopolitical situation, it is anyone's guess. But net net, the region has been looking growth positive.
Thank you so much, Ishan. That is a very well informed assessment. We are very closely following all the ongoing developments here at the GSU as well. So I would encourage the audience to engage with our other forms of content, and we will publish articles and briefs regarding the ASEAN Summit. Thank you so much for tuning in today and look forward to seeing you in the other episodes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Anya.